The Arizona Coyotes might not be in Arizona for much longer if the recent vote against their Tempe deal is any indication. The Yotes might be in real trouble, and a lot of cities are salivating at the idea of another NHL franchise relocating. We'll dive into all of this on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. Everydayers can be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of their favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is completely free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. It helps you to save money and time on all of those very hot-to-trot concert and event tickets. Now, like I said at the top of the episode, we're going to open this off with some very interesting news surrounding the Arizona Coyotes. There has been, of course, a recent saga surrounding this team about where the Yotes are going to be playing in the future. And the city of Tempe was basically given an ultimatum, right? Vote for the proposition to have the Yotes remain, and everything will be peachy clean. Everyone's going to be happy. Things will be great. But the reality is, based on the attendance and the response, which admittedly was, not a great turnout for voters, unfortunately for the Yotes, they really didn't get a great response. Tempe basically just about rejected the team roundly, leaving the Yotes without a long-term agreement for their future. While they have announced that they will be playing at Mullet Arena next season, after that, the future is completely wide open, and I have to imagine that for the NHL and for the Yotes themselves, it is a grim moment. Apparently, the front owner or the front office and ownership group was left rather shaken after the news broke, but curiously, not long before the announcement was made, it came out that they really hadn't spent much money at all campaigning, while the opposition really hammered home the idea that the Yotes are kind of a bit of a parasite. And for me, I feel like the Yotes have always been one of these organizations that just tried to take shortcuts and save money wherever humanly possible. And in this case, that has only hurt them and put them at a disadvantage against an opposition that, quite frankly, isn't that far off, the mark in terms of the reality of the situation. The Yotes haven't exactly honored their lease deals in the past. They're a franchise with mediocre attendance, and for how they've been run recently, it's nothing but an embarrassing PR nightmare, one after another. Just think of the Mitch Miller situation and all of that, and you look at the Yotes being where they are right now, it's not super shocking. It really just shouldn't be happening. This franchise really has been run into the mud, and it's a shame, right? This Yotes team used to be the old Jets. Obviously, they don't really, cling to that history or anything particularly much, but it's a shame to see this once proud franchise look like an embarrassment almost every single evening. The team itself has played reasonably well enough. Clayton Keller and some of the other guys have been doing really well, but unfortunately for Arizona, the team itself is probably not going to be sticking around for much longer. Now, there have been some interesting thoughts about potentially the Phoenix Suns ownership getting involved. Maybe they end up doing some sort of a partnership to buy the team. Could be an option. Obviously, you'd have to renovate the Suns Arena to host an NHL squad, but I guess it is technically an option. I think there are other alternatives. One of the big ones, though, that people have talked about is, these teams that are asking for, like an expansion franchise, would a relocation satisfy their needs instead? And if you were to relocate Arizona, I feel like somebody made a pretty good point on Twitter that more than likely it would actually do more harm than good to the franchise image because the new team is going to be inheriting the mess that is this Coyotes team, and it's just asking for trouble, right? The Yotes are uh, financially not in great straits, if we're being honest. And with all of the publicity scandals and stuff that have happened to this team over the last few years, it'd probably make more sense to start off with a fresh slate. If you're doing like an expansion franchise rather than a relocation situation. I think for us Jets fans, it's a little bit unnerving to see this team go through some of the issues that it has. Thankfully, Winnipeg is a lot better run. I mean, it's really not close, right? But this past season, the Jets kind of gave Winnipeg fans a bit of a scare with some threats about relocation. Not exactly veiled either. So I think it is a concern for Jets fans, going forward. Could Winnipeg go the way of Arizona? The answer is probably not. I don't think we're necessarily in danger of that yet, but I think longer term, you do wonder about the finances of how the Jets are being run, the fact that Thompson isn't necessarily putting in as much cash as he could into their operating reserves, and how that might put the Jets in a really tough spot if the attendance does not improve over the next few years. But thankfully, that is a ways off, not something that we have to think about for next season, at least. Yeah, obviously, in the meantime, there's a big question about trade bait, right? The roster construction is a much more pressing issue for the Jets. And on tonight's show, in just a little bit, we're going to dive into some of the other players that might be of interest to teams if Winnipeg does start auctioning off some names. Maybe there are some players on Winnipeg who could potentially fetch a return that would surprise you, even if you look at their contract and you think to yourself, who on earth would want to take this on? We'll dive into all of that in just a little bit, but before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is the perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. Next time you need parts and accessories, head on over to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits just right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage and look for the green check mark to know the part will fit. If it doesn't, you get your money back. And of course, with over 122 million parts to choose from, eBay Motors is guaranteed to help you find the exact right part for your vehicle. Confidence is the name of the game when it comes to stuff like this, and you can always be sure you'll get a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right price at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us on tonight's show. We just talked about how the Arizona Coyotes might be in a bit of a troubling spot if you're a Yotes fan. We've talked about how, honestly, it does slightly concern Winnipeg in some ways. I wouldn't say it's a directly related thing, but, longer term, I think the Jets, in terms of relocation scares and stuff and some of the declines in attendance, they're thinking about these issues as much as the fans are. So hopefully it never comes to that. We don't want to see the Jets go anywhere else for the time being, and I can't imagine that the team will move in the near future, but if things went really south, obviously it would be a bit of a concern. So let's hope that they don't do that, because that would really be a truly awful, awful timeline. But in the meantime, obviously the Jets are going to be relocating some players rather than the franchise itself. And I've talked about a couple of big names. Shifley and Hellebuck are the most likely. I feel like there's a couple of other candidates that might be fringe options, and we'll talk about those. Some of the big players that could be on the way out. But I think one of the interesting ones that might catch people off guard is Blake Wheeler. I've talked about Wheels maybe hanging up the skates and retiring, which I know a lot of people are like, why would you retire with so much money left on the table? But it really comes down to what is your priority in life, right? Wheels has been around a very long time. He's been playing for, decade and a half, 2 decades. Dude has been playing hockey since, he was a very young guy. And obviously, at this stage of his career, he's made a crap load of cash. He had a huge contract extension for the Jets. He's made plenty of money over the years. And so at the stage of his career, when he's physically unable to keep up with the play like he used to, and, time only runs out with your kids and your wife and all of your family members, At some point, you might ask yourself, I could sit here suffering through all of this crap and probably sit there and watch another season where the Jets either miss the playoffs or get eliminated early on, or I could maybe hang up the skates and hang out with my family instead. And I think that's a much bigger draw than people necessarily give it credit for. I think Blake is really, a great ambassador for the team and certainly a player who has really given his all. I think this past playoff run that we saw was some of the most consistently vibrant play from Blake that we've seen in years. And it still, unfortunately, wasn't enough because he's only one person, and the rest of the team, unfortunately, either got too injured to really rise to the occasion or just had a bit of a flat series. So, Wheeler could be on the move. I don't really know who would be interested in a contract like his. You'd have to retain probably a good chunk of it, maybe 50% or something. And maybe that would be the kind of thing that happens at the trade deadline. You get his cap hit down already, you retain like half of it, and then you sort of go from there with a player who's a lot more palatable to move. Maybe you could move him to the Minnesota Wild, I guess. Maybe the LA Kings. I just don't really know what the market for Wheeler services are, in part because what we're seeing with him, I'm sure every other team out there is seeing. Now, the question is, are they actually interpreting the right things out of it? Are they looking at his lack of transition speed, his occasional issues handling the puck, and some of his slower movement, and seeing the fact that, yeah, he's on the wrong side of his 30s? Or do they see the player who he once was, an elite scorer, an elite creator, a truly dynamic power forward, and they're thinking to themselves, we could have that again? Obviously, for most teams, that's probably not going to be the case. I can't imagine that Wheeler, at the age that he is going to have some miraculous career turnaround. But things like that do happen. It's just, again, highly, highly unlikely. Another player that could potentially be on the chopping block is Nate Schmidt. Now, I feel like Schmidt, for me, is one of those players the Jets would probably have to pay to move. With Schmidt, obviously his cap hit is very high, and he just hasn't really looked all that great recently. His defensive work, I feel, has been pretty below par, and offensively, he's really not doing a lot. I kind of thought that when he got to the Jets, we'd see a much more active and creative blue liner, but it feels like the version of him that sat with the Canucks might be closer to what he is now, which is kind of a shame because Nate, at his best when he was with the Capitals, was very fast, was a dynamic breakout expert, had a nasty shot, and was constantly involved in the offensive buildup on a pretty consistent basis. With the Jets, he does do some of that. It's not like he hasn't done any of it at all. It's just not at a level where you're thinking, yeah, I want to be paying this guy $6+ million a season. Obviously, Schmidt's contract structure may be a little bit different than what it appears in terms of the yearly cap hit, but in terms of the production, the rate of scoring, and all of that stuff, I just really haven't seen anything from Nate that's looked worth it. It's a real shame because he didn't exactly come with an expensive price tag in terms of like draft capital, so that part you don't really mind. But it does feel like I was expecting more from him, and he just hasn't really been able to deliver that on a consistent basis, which is a shame because like when I saw him with the Caps and the Bears, I was always a big Schmitty fan. I loved him. I thought if there was a team that could potentially resurrect his career, it might be the Jets. The opportunity would be there. But I think we're seeing more of what he really is at this stage of his career than what we were kind of hoping for. It's a shame because, like, again, I love Schmidt. I think he brings, like his prime version brings a lot of the skill sets and traits that the Jets have frankly missed on the back end. But in terms of what he's actually been able to accomplish so far, it's been, less than I think the Jets were hoping for. On the flip side, you've got Brendan Dillon, who I feel like has generally lived up to expectations of being a strong defender. I think he's done what you've asked of him, and for the price tag that the Jets paid, yeah, still a little bit expensive for what he brings. But if you contrast it with like what Nate Schmidt has done so far, Dillon, far and away wins. Speaking of Dillon, multiple Dillons might be on the trading block for the Jets here in a few weeks. We'll dive into who those players are and what the Jets could even expect for guys like these in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Birddogs. If you've ever heard of Birddogs, I personally was not familiar with them until recently. they're the only pair of pants that actually adds like an underwear liner, so you only have to wear one pair. Imagine taking all of the fuss out of sorting through boxers or briefs, what have you, and getting yourself the one size fits all, super comfortable Birddogs pair of pants. Obviously, one size does not fit all. They have plenty of great sizes to choose from, but in terms of comfort and versatility, you could kind of think of it as your one-stop solution to all of your pants needs. Plenty of folks out there have actually had it. College football nerds love this stuff. Brett Kreischer actually loves it. He has a couple of pairs of Birddogs that he chills in his backyard with. I mean, you really can't go wrong with a pair of pants that includes a great, comfortable liner. And it really, for a lot of us who want to reduce our closet space and stuff, it helps save you time and space, which is at a premium when you have lots of pairs of pants and lots of pairs of underwear. So if you're ready to get started, go to birddogs.com/lockedonnhl. And when you enter promo code LockedOnNHL, they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti style tumbler with every single order. Check out the comfort, fit, and versatility for a great pair of Birddogs. Be sure to place your order right now. I promise you, you won't regret it. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us on these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We're just wrapping up really quickly with some final considerations on players who might be on the trading block. I mentioned that a bunch of players named Dylan from the Jets might be on the way out. Dylan DeMello, I think, for me, might be the most prominent among all of these guys. DeMello, I love. I'm a huge fan of his ability to be an extremely stabilizing top four defensive force. He's been a monster for this team. He's been Winnipeg's best out-and-out defender before Sandberg arrived, and DeMello could basically work with almost any player that you put him with and generally put up pretty good results. You haven't really seen too many defenders like that for this Jets team, or just too many players in general who do the kinds of things that Dylan does. And if you were to trade him, you're not going to get much back. I think at this stage of his career, DeMello probably gets you maybe a second or a third round pick or something, maybe an extra pick along with that. But generally speaking, not a ton. And you have to weigh the value of his contract going out with the potential return in futures, which just won't be all that expensive. Brendan Dillon, I think, is a lot more palatable as a player that you could trade, especially if your intent is to get younger and faster on the back end. Brendan is a great defensive defender, but I feel like a lot of what we've talked about in terms of Winnipeg's finishing and lack of offensive production partly starts with the back end, right? You want guys who can be aggressive, who can drop below the face-off circles, and who can pinch low in times of overwhelming offensive strength to try and force mismatches. You need that support down low, and Dylan's just not that kind of player. He's a very strong physical defensive type, but whether you think that is really worth keeping around for what the Jets paid for him, which is like, 2 second-rounders, I think is a very debatable thing. And with the Jets kind of moving towards a younger team going forward, I do think Dylan might be one of the more hotly requested names. Even if the trade return isn't going to be that great, it's probably going to be at best like a second and a fourth rounder or something. You take that and run. I think at this point you don't really care. Just opening up the cap space and giving another spot to maybe a left-sided defender prospect might be worth it in and of itself. Now, the last player that I think might be of interest to teams is Mason Appleton, not because he's particularly great at a lot of stuff, but I feel like teams are going to see his two-way work ethic, okay production here and there, and defensive impacts, and think that this guy is like a PK wonderkind. For Mason, I feel like I was hoping he'd have a better year this season. I thought maybe coming back from the Kraken, we might see more of those traits that compared him favorably to Andrew Kopp. But thus far, Mason's looked more like a replacement level middle six player, and I feel like that for me was a big disappointment from what I was expecting. He's not the worst player on the Jets by a country mile, but he's still not really stamped his authority and his identity on this team in a way to where I'd be upset if he left. I think Mason might be better served moving to another team, and with a cap hit that's on the lower side, and him being a younger player, he could be a guy that maybe you get like a second or a third round pick for. That just kind of seems to be the trade pick range for like a mid-tier player, maybe a little bit lower. I mean, the Jets didn't exactly pay a lot for him when he came back from Seattle, but you never know. Let me know what you think of these trade returns and who else you might be interested in seeing teams claim from the Jets. There are plenty of candidates for trades, and honestly, the Jets might have a lot of departures this offseason. Give me your predictions on players headed out the door in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's show, though, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day every day. We will see you here tomorrow, and as always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.